So Lee, thank you very much for agreeing to have a chat with me. You know, there's not many books, there's not many authors that when I tell people that I'm going to have a chat with the author, people ask me to put orders in for signed books. This is the first time. Have you found that this has generated a lot of interest?
Um, I mean, it's interested a lot of people. I think it's been a bit challenging to people who have very fixed ideological views, as one might expect. But otherwise, yes, I think people are surprised to hear that until the 1970s, trans people self-identified, got affirmative medical care, corrected their birth certificates, and lived in complete equality. I think that's a surprise to most people. And I think it's the next shock is realizing that that equality was removed and that we had a generation of people from 1970 to 1996 who were socially excluded, had no employment rights, lost their civil liberties, were pilloried by the press and subjected to a really brutal NHS regime, which, you know, included compulsory sterilisation, which is really very grim. So
I can add,
I think
no,
there's a lot of shock.
Okay, I can add some context to that as well. You know, I remember when I was growing up as a small child, and we used to like watching TV shows like The Wheel Tappers and Shunter's Social Club. And there was a ventriloquist talk called Terry Rogers, and nobody ever mentioned that that person was actually trans. I believe if you can't see something, you can't be something. So that's why I say to people, if you don't see a role model, be one. But on the same time as that was going on, and we were all enjoying this person had funny bones, and the surreal thing is she's being introduced onto the stage by Bernard Manning, and everyone's just enjoying her comedy. But at the same time, there was a man, I'm assuming, was a couple of streets away from me who wore makeup on women's clothing. And we were told to keep away from that person because they were a pervert and they were deviant, and don't go in that person's house, she'll never come out. And I sort of feel that it's all tied in with the let's not talk about it. Because there's a lot of people there who would have been absolute role models who a lot of people don't know about. 'Cause I mean, I deliver training in this area, and I love my trans history, I really do. And when I say some of the people, you know, like Dr. James Barry and such like, it's people are so surprised to think, how come we never knew about these? Have you got any thoughts about over time why we haven't heard about these people? It almost feels like it's like erasure to me as a trans person.
Oh, well, it is erasure at some point. Historically, you know, we didn't have the language. So we don't really have the idea of the term trans. And when we do have it, it's introduced in a negative sense until, you know, the 1940s. And certainly medically, all the way through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, most of the 60s, what we now call being trans was classified as an intersex condition, a variation of sex development. And so legally and medically, it was unproblematic. It wasn't really until the April Ashley case, Corbett versus Corbett in 1970, which created a new legal definition of trans people, not a medical one and not a scientific one, but a legal definition of trans people as being floridly psychotic and therefore requiring control. So as the term trans starts to enter our language, so we start to see at that moment trans people being subjected to social exclusion and ultimately, as you say, erasure. And certainly from 1970 to 1996, trans lives were erased. I mean, really the attempt was not just to erase the idea of trans, but to erase trans people. So that historically, again, if we take these three things, if you take a specific group of people, if you remove their civil liberties, if you socially exclude them, and if you subject them to sterilisation, then those are the three conditions that form what we call genocide. a very, very shocking word and a very shocking idea. But certainly for some of the doctors involved in the treatment of trans people, they were very aware that they were involved in a eugenic project to get rid of undesirable people. And that was the case from 1970 to 1996. Before then, back into far history, until it's criminalized, we don't have any problems. So our starting point, medically and legally, is 1886 with Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Psychopathia Sexualis, the first medico-legal definition of being trans, which identifies trans people as intersex. So we only have the idea of being translator, and we only have the idea of trans exclusion, trans eradication, we might see much later. So we're in living memory. And this, I think, is another thing that's very shocking to the reader, that completely unwittingly, without any knowledge, so many people have been unconsciously complicit in the erasure of trans lives as part of, as I say, unfortunately, the historical term is, transgenocide, which is a very dreadful thing to think about.
I mean, I said to you in an email that now I almost feel as if your book's a game changer with understanding. I think it's such an important piece of work. That's why I feel blessed to be able to speak to you, to be totally honest with you. Can I ask, where does your interest in this subject, because, you know, did you notice something in this area and it just irked your interest? What was the thing that made you want to get into this subject as a writer? Because it's took a fair amount of time to complete, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. Well, I've been involved in LGBT civil liberties for over 30 years now. I was a co-chair of the Gay and Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists for a while. I co-founded the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity with Dr. Lynn Jones, MP, back in 1994. And I was working with legal teams on LGBTI legal rights, taking the UK government to court and so on. A very exciting time. And working with, of course, all of the people who are famous, like Stephen Whittle from Press for Change. So I was assuming that because we did so well in court from 1996 onwards, I was assuming that things were just going to get automatically better for trans people in the way that they had for recently. Lesbians and gay men. Yes, that's right. And that wasn't happening. Now, I knew that there was something to do with primogeniture, and I'd got it in my mind that that was a stumbling block. But in 2013, the monarchy got rid of primogeniture so that now princesses can inherit equally with princes. And after that, I thought, okay, primogeniture will go away and we'll have trans equality. That's the stumbling block. But by 2015, things were starting to get worse. There was some really obnoxious stuff in the press. And so I thought, what was it about that Ewan Forbes case? And I'd retired from my NHS post at that point, so I'd got the time to go and blow the dust off 500 pages of court transcript and do a forensic analysis of it. And I was very, very shocked, honestly, by what I found. So I then worked backwards to 1886 just to make sure that what I found was true and to corroborate that narrative. And then I worked forwards from Ewan's case, which was decided in 1968, to the present day. That meant reading an awful lot of archival stuff written by, trans communities in the 1970s. Very, very distressing indeed to read. Very dark. People struggling for identity, struggling to understand what had happened to them.
Imagine struggling to exist.
Just dreadful. And the book grew out of that.
It's just, I'm blown away because I consider myself quite knowledgeable in this area, but I hadn't heard of Ewan. I hadn't heard of that story. And it's when we do research on things like Trans History Month that we start seeing people. We start seeing like characters from the past that come to life. And I just feel Ewan's story, because it challenges that, you know, the right to take a title. And then after that, when I was listening to you on a radio piece, and we were talking about the steps of how it was, like, why wasn't it well known? Was it a case of Ewan wanting it keeping private for his own privacy, or was there anything else at play? Because it doesn't seem to be something that's been generally out there in the public knowledge.
Oh no, it was deliberately hidden. So
how could that happen?
Well, first of all, the case was heard in camera. So for your listeners who don't know the Ewan story, born in 1912, son of an aristocratic Scots family, gets very early endocrinological support when he's a kid. So he's the earliest child that I know of to have affirmative medical care. So he doesn't go through the wrong puberty. 100 years ago, we have a kid not going through the wrong puberty, which is great. And that becomes the local doctor. Life is fine for him until 1965 when his older brother dies. Or I should say he becomes a local doctor. He corrects his birth certificate, as you could in those days, gets married. Life is fine until his older brother dies, and then the title comes up for inheritance. And this is a primogenitor title. It can only be inherited by the next male in line. And Ewan is challenged for this by his cousin on the grounds that Ewan isn't a real man. Really rather a familiar slur that, you know, we still hear. It ends in a court case. Ewan manages to get the court case heard in secret. His sister-in-law knows a guy called Cecil King, who was a newspaper baron at the time, and the press effectively gagged. Because Ewan wins his case, that produces a constitutional crisis. If a trans man can inherit a primogenitor baronetcy, then, because the crown was primogenitor at that time, a trans man could inherit the crown. So, you might think you know who the next heir is, assigned male at birth, but they might turn out to be, you know, trans and no longer eligible for the crown. Or they might turn out to have an older sibling assigned female at birth who's trans and challenges them for the crown. And since constitutional law is about securing succession of the crown for political stability, then this was really a big, hot issue. Everyone involved in the case was sworn to secrecy, and all records of the case were removed from the public eye. It took me 2 years and the direct intervention of the Home Secretary to get the papers released.
That is, it's just mind blowing. I'm actually personally grateful, and I know from all of my friends who have found out about this story, everybody it's like we're actually really grateful for the time and effort that you've put into this. And this is available in bookstores now, isn't it?
It is. You can get it in bookstores in paper form. You can get it as a Kindle version. You can get it as an audiobook. And
who's doing it? Who's reading it?
The audiobook is read by Rebecca Root.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's awesome. I love audiobooks. When I'm working in Kent at the minute, and I'm driving back up north at the weekend. So I think I might have the audiobook to drive home with.
No, good idea. Yeah. And it's currently being optioned for a television miniseries by Jules Hussey from Brazen Productions, a company that has a very strong trans-affirmative production policy.
Yeah, I really hope that goes through, because I feel I mean, I don't know what you think about the current situation. I came out as trans in 2012, Zoe. And although I felt at the time I had a 2-year wait to be seen by the gender clinic, I actually completed my journey in February this year. But I know nowadays, even though I thought it wasn't the safest of places when I first came out, nowadays it seems with the media and some of the narratives that play that seem to be given a valid voice. That literally are calling for the invalidation of trans people. People who are calling for, like, if you're affirmative towards a trans person, you're actually committing gay conversion therapy. It blows my mind the levers of mechanisms of hate that are at play. But now people have got up to a 5-year wait to be seen by the gender clinic. Obviously, class is always an issue because people who are suffering with poverty don't have the option to go private. So that ties in there. And I just feel as if the world's got darker in the past few years. Do you see a way forward where, because I feel beyond all of this, the world has to come together. I really believe that, back in the day when people had used racist slurs as pronouns towards people, when we used to have horrible names for people who had Down syndrome, we've all moved forward and like people who use those names aren't vilified now. So I do feel that moving forward, there has to be a way where people can come together. I feel there's a radical middle road. I'd love to know your thoughts on how we can move forward in a sense of, I do feel that it has to come with rights for trans people. And I sort of feel as if we might end up down the road where intersex people are actually, they have a unisex birth certificate and that moves on. Maybe that's a bit forward thinking also. But what's your thoughts around that, if you don't mind me asking?
No, of course. Well, you see, in academia, we tend to proceed by evidence and fact, and that's really quite different from fixed ideological views. And it does seem rather as though there's an awful lot of media space given to people who have ideological views rather than the facts of the matter. The facts of the matter are really very simple. Trans equality was never a problem in the past. There is no reason why trans equality should be a problem now. It's as simple as that. It's interesting and regrettable to see a whole range of old slurs thrown at trans people now. The commonest and the oldest, I suppose, is that of sexual predator. That was what gay men were accused of and criminalised for. For a long time, gay men weren't allowed to teach in primary schools. In the 1970s, lesbians were accused by heterosexual women of being sexual predators. And now we find the slur of sexual predation being thrown at trans people. And I think what worries me as much as anything else in all of that is it diverts attention from the real location of sexual predation, which is nothing to do with the LGBT community. We know where sexual abuse occurs. We know who the sexual predators are, and they're not LGBT people. So that's a big concern. My hope is that we will shift from the current hysteria into a period of rationality and fact, and that we will move forward to a position where everyone is equal simply by virtue of being born, because that is the most fundamental human right.
That's, you're so right. I know some people will be thinking, when you says previously it was an easy process for people to change the birth certificate. Could you expand on that a little bit for people? Because I know people will accuse me of not asking you to delve deeper into that aspect. I know they will. And this is a one-shot opportunity for me to talk to you. So
yeah, sure. So in the 1920s and early 1930s, we have synthetic hormones being produced, estrogen and testosterone. And it was these were things that were sold effectively over the counter, in the same way that during the First World War, you could pop into Harrods and buy little packets of heroin to send to the boys at the front line. So you used to be able to just go and buy over-the-counter estrogen and testosterone.
They don't talk about that much either, do they, Zoe?
They don't know. And so it was relatively easy to procure. So it was quite common to, first of all, you self-identify as trans. It was common for people to either self-medicate or to go to on the NHS after 1948, when the NHS was created. Even before 1948, you would still go to, typically, there was a surgeon called Lennox Broster who operated at Charing Cross Hospital. And you would go to see Lennox Broster, you would self-identify, you would get whatever affirmative medical care you wanted, so endocrinology, reconstructive surgery, and then you'll take your letter either from Mr. Broster or whichever other clinician was working in that area. You took your letter down to the Central Registry Office saying that, you know, you were trans, except it didn't say that. It said, you know, you were intersex or gave any one of a range of conditions. Sometimes for trans women, the letter simply said that they had a congenital absence of a vagina. And, you know, you would present your letter with the medical evidence and get your birth certificate corrected.
So it feels like a lot less gatekeeping.
And you have full legal equality.
Yeah, it feels like there was a lot less. Yeah, it feels like there was a lot less gatekeeping back in those days.
Well, no, that's right. I mean, there was a psychologist at Charing Cross, and he was there largely because there was this concern that to weed out gay men, and for that matter, lesbians, but gay men especially because they were still criminalised, remember, until 1967, from everyone else. And so if you were unlucky, then you might be put through one of the tests that they had to work out whether you were gay or not. But generally speaking, you know, a word to the wise would avoid that. You could have counselling support if you wished it, but it was the control of the clinical pathway was far more in the hands of the patient. It was far more consultative. From the 1970s onwards, really until the present day, or until the last 10 years, it became far less consultative. But yeah, that was the situation, and countless people did that. I mean, there was this notion at the time, because of visibility, that there were far more trans men, and the trans women were the rarity. So all the way through the 30s, there's a famous athlete called Mark.
It's nice to be exotic.
And the attention is on this thing, this phenomenon of virilism, as they called it. We even see Simone de Beauvoir saying, you know, we know that some girls, especially athletic ones, become boys. And trans women were regarded as a rarity. And this was just a question of visibility.
That's really interesting. You know, do you know, I'm sure you will, about Mark Weston.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mark Weston, because I was reading a newspaper report from the time when Mark Weston transitioned to be Mark, and he said in the interview that he considered himself a girl who liked to put powder on his face, and when the doctors, I think they identified an intersex condition and said he'd be better assimilated living as a male. And he wasn't comfortable with that until he spent time in the company of males, and then he felt absolutely natural. And that man, I think, there was known as the Devonshire Wonder, you know, when they were an athlete in the 1920s. But that man died in 1978, and I think it's an absolute shame that there's so many people that would have been absolute role models that we never knew about. And they never had the opportunity to actually be accepted as the role models that they actually were. Because I think now, and I think partly because of your book, it's going to bring attention to people looking into history at some quite colourful characters, I'd say. It's like some I'm aware of, such as like Murray Hall, and there's so many different characters in the past that you think, well, that's just crazy. But these people lived their lives, and we're only finding out about them long after they've passed away. I think it's an absolute crying shame, to be fair. I really do. If we were putting the blame at somebody for the erasure, whose door would we put the blame at? See, if it was governmental, I can see trans people putting in for damages.
I mean, I don't think there's any question but that the way in which trans people had their civil liberties removed was, very deliberate. The judgment in Corbett versus Corbett was very deliberate. At first, April Ashley says in her biography that she thought it would only affect her ability to marry. But then very rapidly, it affected everything else. And what we don't have at all is a record, because trans people's civil liberties were removed without any debate in Parliament, without any new statutory law being passed. It was this kind of grey bureaucratic process of just deciding that people didn't have rights. Sometimes we can see this happening in the committee stages for the Sex Discrimination Act of 1974. We can see on the committee, someone asks a question. Now, are we clear that the Sex Discrimination Act is going to cover people that we sometimes read about in the press, the person says, called transsexuals? And the answer is clearly yes, they've been taken into account. At committee stage, trans people are covered by the Sex Discrimination Act. When the Act is passed, they're not. They're not included. So we can see that something's happened. Pressure's been brought to bear.
Yes. I think it's quite interesting that for a binary world, trans people lost the rights in the grey area. And the world now seems to have a problem with the grey area as well, to be fair. I think we've got a lot of growing to do as human beings, haven't we? If we're going to get to that inclusive place that actually allows people to be. This book, we haven't even said the title of the book.
Oh, the book is called The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes.
Brilliant. How long's the audio book? It looks quite meaty, that. Am I going to get through it in 5 hours on a drive home? I'm going to have to drive back to listen to it all.
You'll have to drive slowly and perhaps sit in the car outside your house for a while.
Something? I will. I drive slowly anyway, so I'm definitely getting one. And it's like, well, I'm not getting one. I know there's a few. We're coming out of hopefully coming out of lockdown. Is there any book signings coming up? Or because I'll tell you, I'm not going to lie to you. I want 3 signed books. Do you know what I mean? I want 3 signed books. Can I just send you? Just between me and you, can I just send you the money and you post those 3 signed books out anytime when you've got time? Can we sort that out between me and thee?
Yes, we can, if you like. Ellie, I can do that.
Right, we will talk beyond this then. Something.
You'll need to tell me who you want them signing to.
Oh, I will, definitely. I will. Yeah. Two has been requested, and one's a surprise present, which is going to make somebody's year, to be fair.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
So there you go.
Let's do that.
Right. So, well, something, Zoe. Like, thank you very much. I stumbled across. It was actually my friend Emma in Glasgow says, Ellie, you need to see this. And I think she heard you on the radio interview, and then she sent me the newspaper article about her. And I thought, how come I didn't know about this? And it just blows my mind. When we look back over time, I think there's lots of movies that could be made about people who've gone through life who are trans. And I think that erasure has just robbed the world of such a richness in that area. Of the whole triumph over adversity thing, I really do. So then, from seeing them to being able to have a chat with you for the show and to get the podcast out and put it out in the media, because I just want, when I do my training sessions now, when people ask me, which book can I recommend so they can learn more about the bigger situation. You've now become a name that I can say you need to buy this book. And something, I'm not just speaking for me, I'm sure I'm speaking for many people who maybe don't get the chance to speak with you, because I understand how blessed I am to do so. We're very grateful indeed. Let's move it across a little touch. How does a person get 5 degrees?
Oh, well, I'm an insecure overachiever, I think, Ellie. That's the answer.
I seen 5 degrees. I thought 5 degrees. I thought, how does one person even do that? That's just absolutely off it. Do you like music? Because this will also be going out on my Sunday morning radio show on CBFM Radio, Zoe. And when I do my radio pieces, I always ask the guest for a song or a piece of music. And I have this concept about everyone has a theme tune. So my theme tune, it's obscure Mary Lou Lord song called Seven Sisters. But if I was looking at an empowerment song, I'd maybe be looking at something like anything by Queen or, Don't Stop Believing, something like that. Do you have any music like that has been really important to you, and like either a theme song or an empowerment song that you listen to that makes you feel, come on, because I want to play it after this interview?
Yes, for sure. Well, part of the soundtrack of my life, being born when I was in the 50s, was Bob Dylan. Oh. And so I grew up to Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changing. Mm. And I think that's an appropriate song. It's not just the times are a-changing. It's a trans people and trans allies everywhere are going to change them. So I'd go with Bob Dylan.